It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, just past the lunch rush at a KFC on the edge of a bustling city. The kind of place where time slows down, where the aroma of crispy fried chicken and freshly baked biscuits seems to hang in the air, reminding everyone of simpler days. The neon lights outside flickered in the warm summer sun, casting a golden glow over the weathered plastic tables inside. Most of the customers were strangers to each other, lost in their own worlds of work emails, phone calls, or hurried conversations. But then, as if the world itself paused to witness something unexpected, the door swung open. Tom Cruise walked in. He wasn't dressed in his usual Hollywood glamour, no red carpets or designer suits today. Instead, he was wearing a simple black hoodie, baseball cap and jeans. He had come in just like any other regular customer, craving the kind of comfort food that could ground even the most famous of people. But the second he entered, a ripple of recognition swept through the small restaurant. A few heads turned, and whispers began to rise. "Is that Tom Cruise? No way, it's really him." The shock of seeing the A-list actor in a modest fast food joint like KFC was almost too much for some to process. The room went quiet for a moment, before the murmur of disbelief grew louder, like a growing wave. Tom glanced around. A half-smile tugged at his lips, but it was forced, like someone going through the motions of normal life, despite the fact that normal was something he had lost a long time ago. He walked toward the counter, greeted by the cashier with a nervous smile and a shake of the head. She'd never imagined serving a superstar on a normal Tuesday, let alone one who was probably tired of the constant spotlight. "Hi, what can I get for you today?" the young cashier asked, trying her best to hold it together. Tom's eyes softened. He gave a slight nod, his voice calm and unpretentious. "I'll take a bucket of chicken, mashed potatoes, and a soda. Thanks." There was something almost sad about the way he said it, as though he didn't need the fame, or the attention, or the life that came with it. As though, for just a moment, he wanted to be like everyone else. As he waited for his order, two little girls, no older than 8 or 9, sat at a nearby table, eyes wide as they quietly observed him. They weren't gawking, like the rest of the crowd. They weren't whispering among themselves, trying to figure out what a star like him was doing in a place like this. They simply watched with an unbothered innocence, like he was just another person. And that's exactly what made Tom stop. There was a moment of silence, almost like a magnetic pull. Tom's eyes met theirs for a brief second, and he smiled genuinely. The kind of smile that reached his eyes, as if they were reminding him of something he had lost long ago. His gaze softened. He looked back at them, realizing that their gaze was not the kind of admiration or awe that he was used to. No, they weren't thinking of his movies, his fame, or the tabloid stories that followed him around. Then one of the little girls, the braver one of the two, leaned in toward her sister and whispered something, so quietly that only Tom could hear. It was barely above a breath, but her words landed with the weight of something much deeper. The other girl looked back at her, eyes wide, before they both turned their heads to look at Tom again. Something about their exchange unsettled him. For the first time in ages, Tom felt like a real person again, not a character on a screen or a piece of tabloid gossip. There was no flattery, no expectations, just two innocent souls, untainted by the pressures of the world. Tom glanced away, but the words they had whispered echoed in his mind, scratching away at the carefully constructed walls he had built over the years. The smell of fried chicken filled the air as his order was called out, but he wasn't quite ready to pick it up. His hands lingered, feeling something unexpected, something vulnerable he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the innocence of those little voices. Maybe it was the sincerity in their gaze. But it didn't take long for the reality to hit. Tom Cruise, the man who had been everything to everyone, the man whose life was lived out in front of cameras and screens, was starting to wonder who he truly was when the cameras weren't rolling. Tom stood there for a moment longer than expected, staring down at his soda, his mind caught between the present and the weight of the past. The hum of conversations around him faded into the background. He didn't know why the little girl's whisper had affected him so much. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a few words, barely audible to anyone else. But to him, It felt like a crack in the carefully built facade he had worn for years. He had spent most of his life running away from things. His real self, the emotions he buried under the gloss of fame, and the haunting loneliness that came with the constant attention. There had been a time when he welcomed the limelight, when the world's gaze felt like validation. But now, years later, it felt like a cage. Every corner he turned, every interaction, was tainted by the assumption that he was simply Tom Cruise, the Hollywood superstar. The real man underneath had long since been lost, swallowed by the persona. And here, in a random KFC in a random city, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Humanity. Not as a superstar, not as a man worth millions, but as someone who could go unnoticed in the world. Just a person, like the two little girls sitting at the table, eating their fries, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. The last thing he wanted was to be swept up in a flood of emotions in a fast food joint. But there it was, his heart racing as he felt the weight of something much deeper than his fame. A yearning for connection. A yearning to be understood, to not be seen as just an icon, but as a person. He hadn't realized how much he had longed for that until now. A soft voice broke through his reverie. "Your order, sir," the cashier said, holding out the tray with the bucket of chicken, mashed potatoes, and soda. Her eyes were wide with the sort of awe people often had when meeting someone famous, but there was no judgment. No fawning. Just a polite gesture, a moment of normalcy. Tom took the tray without speaking. He flashed a tight smile, nodded and turned, finding his way to an empty booth in the back. He set the tray down, but the food didn't seem to matter anymore. It wasn't the meal he was hungry for. It was something much more intangible, something he had chased his entire life, but could never fully grasp: real connection. Unfiltered, honest connection. As he sat down, his eyes wandered back to the little girls. They were still eating their fries, still talking softly to each other in a language only they understood. He found himself watching them more intently now, as if they held the answers to questions he had never asked aloud. He didn't know what their words had been, but he felt certain that whatever they were whispering, it had nothing to do with the image the world had painted of him. He had been through so much: public scrutiny, failed relationships, the pressure of being a living legend. And yet here, in a place where he wasn't Tom Cruise the actor, he felt more vulnerable than ever. More real. The thought crossed his mind. What would it be like to start over? To be someone no one expected? He leaned back in the booth, taking a deep breath. His thoughts were interrupted when the little girl, the one who had whispered to her sister, glanced over at him. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and then, without warning, the older sister stood up and walked over to him. Tom didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't ready for this. The girl stood there awkwardly for a second, unsure of what to say. She must have been about 8 years old, with wide brown eyes that seemed to look right through him. Not starstruck, but with something else, something deeper. She shifted from one foot to the other, her hands clasped in front of her. Tom raised an eyebrow, confused. "Hey there," he said softly, giving her a small smile. The girl swallowed, looking up at him with a mixture of shyness and courage. I just wanted to say that you don't have to be famous to be kind," she said, her words so simple yet so direct. "My sister and I, we think you're nice." Tom froze. The words hit him harder than he anticipated. She wasn't talking about his movies or his fame, or anything related to the Tom Cruise that everyone knew. She was talking about him, the person sitting here in front of her, a man trying to find peace in the ordinary, the forgotten moments of life. Her words pierced through him, unraveling the walls he had carefully constructed for years. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. He hadn't expected this innocent honesty from someone so young. It wasn't about what he had done or how successful he was. It was just about being human. The girl smiled and, without another word, turned back to her sister, who had been watching from their table. But Tom didn't look away. He watched them, their small, ordinary lives unfolding before him in the simplest of gestures. And for the first time in years, Tom Cruise realized that he hadn't been living in the moment, not truly. He had been so focused on the next role, the next interview, the next milestone, that he had lost touch with the real world. But here, with these two little girls, it was different. They didn't know who he was in the grand scheme of things, and yet they saw something in him that no one else had. It was a small act, a simple moment, but it had touched him more deeply than he could have imagined. Tom's thoughts began to swirl. He needed to figure out who he was when the world wasn't watching. He didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't about fame or the glossy image the world had of him. It was about something real, something raw and authentic. He took a deep breath, the weight on his chest easing just a little, and picked up the bucket of chicken. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to taste something more than food. He was ready to taste life again. As Tom sat there, slowly picking at his food, the hum of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. But his thoughts were far from peaceful. The words of the little girl echoed in his mind, and his heart tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite describe. You don't have to be famous to be kind. Her voice was so soft, so simple. Yet it had unraveled something inside him that he had been trying to ignore for years. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tom was confronting something deeper than the glossy surface of his fame. He had spent so much of his life trying to outrun the expectations, the flashing lights, the constant pressure to perform, to be someone bigger than life itself. But now, in this small corner of a KFC, surrounded by strangers who didn't care who he was or what he'd done, he felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him. What did it mean to be kind when the whole world thought of you as a symbol? What did it mean to be real when everyone expected you to be larger than life? His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Tom pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The text was from his agent, Greg. "Where are you? You're supposed to be on a flight to LA in an hour for the new project. The production meeting is in 45 minutes. Tom's stomach churned. He had been so caught up in this unexpected moment of clarity that he had forgotten about the looming responsibilities he had waiting for him. A new film, a new character, another round of interviews, another cycle of Hollywood that he had been a part of for decades. For a second he debated ignoring the message, but he knew he couldn't. That was the life he had built. He had responsibilities. People were counting on him. His agent, the director, the crew, they all depended on him. He couldn't simply walk away, could he? Tom sighed and typed a quick response. "On my way. Just needed a break." He hit send, but the thought lingered. Was it just a break? Or was this his life now? A life of endless cycles, always moving, always performing, always being something for everyone else, but never really being anything for himself. Before he could get too lost in his thoughts again, the sound of a familiar voice broke through. "Tom, man, is that you?" The voice was loud, booming, a bit too much for the small restaurant. Tom looked up and saw a figure approaching. It was John, a fellow actor he'd known for years. They had shared several film sets together, and John had been one of the few people in the industry who had stayed in Tom's corner through thick and thin. He was older now, with salt and pepper hair, and a beard that had grown longer with age, but his broad shoulders and confident stride hadn't changed a bit. "John," Tom said with a half-smile, standing up to shake his hand. The two men shared a quick embrace, a sort of brotherhood that came from the shared trials of Hollywood. "What are you doing here?" John chuckled, gesturing to the tray of food in Tom's hands. "I'm eating the same thing as you. It's called being normal, Tom." He sat down across from Tom without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the restaurant. Tom chuckled weakly. "Normal, huh? It's a nice change." John's grin faded slightly as he studied Tom's face more carefully. "You don't seem like yourself. Everything okay?" Tom hesitated. There was something about John's gaze that made him pause, like the man could see through the layers of bravado and fame. But Tom quickly shook his head. "Yeah, just taking a minute." John raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, he grabbed a fry from Tom's tray and took a bite. "You know, I heard you were in a bit of a slump lately," John said casually, watching Tom from under his brow. "People are starting to talk. There's talk of another movie project falling through. Your last one didn't do as well as expected. And then I saw the headline about your latest struggles with personal life." Tom felt his face tighten. The mention of his recent personal struggles, the failed marriage, the rumors about his mental health, the public spectacle of it all, making his chest tighten. It was like hearing a name he didn't recognize, a name that belonged to someone else. A version of him that didn't exist anymore. "Everyone has problems, John," Tom muttered, his voice colder than he intended. "I'm just figuring it out. That's all." But John, never one to shy away from a direct confrontation, leaned in a bit closer. "Are you sure you're figuring it out, Tom? Because from the outside, it looks like you're running away from everything. The work, the personal stuff, the fame. Are you even happy anymore?" Tom's heart hammered in his chest. John's words hit like a punch to the gut. Tom had built his entire life around running from the things he couldn't control, trying to keep ahead of the chaos, of the expectations. He had used work as a crutch, the constant flow of projects and press as a shield. But here, in this moment, those walls felt flimsy, like they might crumble at any second. "I don't know, man," Tom admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I feel stuck." John studied him for a long moment, his face softening. "You're not stuck, Tom. You're just avoiding the real stuff. You can't run forever, you know?" Tom looked away, his gaze drifting back to the little girls, who were now finishing their fries and preparing to leave. Their innocent chatter filled the space, a stark contrast to the heavy weight of his thoughts. What did they know? What did they see in him? "Maybe you're right," Tom muttered, more to himself than to John. "But how do I change? How do I become something else when the world only wants one version of me?" John sighed, leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You'll figure it out. But you can't hide forever, Tom. You can't hide from yourself." As John got up to leave, Tom remained seated, lost in thought. He could feel the weight of his words, the pressure, the reality of everything he had been avoiding. The conflict was growing, and he knew that he couldn't keep pretending. It wasn't just about the movie roles or the fame. It was about him, the man behind the camera, the person who had forgotten what it meant to live without the filter of a public image. Tom's phone buzzed again, a reminder of his responsibilities. Another flight, another meeting, another day. But this time, the feeling was different. The familiar sense of duty no longer comforted him. Now it only felt like an obligation, a role he was expected to play. His gaze flickered back to the little girls as they waved goodbye to him, their innocence still untouched by the world's harsh judgments. For the first time in a long time, Tom found himself asking, what would it be like to walk away from everything? Tom sat in the KFC, his thoughts a whirlwind as the minutes ticked by. The questions that had been swirling in his mind, about his life, his purpose, his place in the world, seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. He absent-mindedly stirred his mashed potatoes, but his mind was far from the comfort food in front of him. Instead, he kept replaying the little girl's words in his head. "You don't have to be famous to be kind." She was right, wasn't she? He could no longer ignore the fact that despite his wealth, his fame, and the endless accolades, something inside him had been hollow for a long time. Kindness, real human connection, those things had become rare commodities in his world, replaced by superficial exchanges and fake smiles. But could he truly change? Could he just drop everything and be a different version of himself? As he pondered, the door to the restaurant opened, and a new set of customers walked in, distracting him from his thoughts. It was a father and daughter, both laughing, both clearly in a good mood. The father was holding a tray, loaded with food, while the daughter clutched her favorite toy, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Tom watched them for a moment, an odd feeling of envy creeping in. This was the kind of simple, pure connection he had been missing for years. The kind of love that wasn't influenced by the spotlight, the cameras, or the pressure to be something for others. The father noticed Tom staring and waved him over. Tom gave a small, uncertain smile but stood up and approached them. He knew the routine, the polite conversation, the, "Hey, you're Tom Cruise" moment, the brief exchange, and then moving on. But today something felt different. "Hey, Tom," the father said enthusiastically. "Big fan. Mind if I sit with you?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, why not?" They all sat down at the table, the little girl staring at Tom with wide eyes. Tom smiled at her, but there was a subtle discomfort in the interaction. He wasn't used to this kind of normalcy anymore. this kind of interaction that felt real. The father introduced himself as Adam, a construction worker, and his daughter as Sophie. The small talk began, but the words seemed to get stuck in Tom's throat. He tried to be polite, but he couldn't help but notice the difference between Adam and the people he usually interacted with. Adam's life was simple, grounded. He didn't need to be anywhere, impress anyone, or live up to some impossible expectation. He was content in his modest life, and Tom found himself envious of that contentment. As the conversation shifted, Adam asked Tom, "So, what brings you here? On a break from filming?" Tom nodded, but his gaze flickered to the table, his hand fiddling with his napkin. "Yeah, just needed a break, I guess. Things have been complicated." Adam raised an eyebrow, but before he could ask further, Sophie piped up, "You're a superhero, right? Like in the movies?" Tom chuckled at her innocent question, his heart sinking. "Not exactly," he replied. "I play superheroes sometimes, but no, I'm just a regular guy." Sophie looked up at him with a frown. "But you're famous. And famous people get everything they want. How come you're sad then?" Her innocent observation hit Tom like a punch. How come? That was the question he had been asking himself all day. Why wasn't fame enough? Why wasn't success enough? Why wasn't money enough? He looked at Sophie, her big, hopeful eyes expecting him to answer in a way that made sense. But for the first time in a long time, he realized how little he truly understood about the things that mattered. Adam seemed to sense Tom's discomfort and quickly changed the topic. "Sophie's got a big dance recital coming up. She's been practicing every day." Tom smiled, but the words felt empty. The realization hit him harder. He had no personal passion, no small moments that brought him joy outside of his career. He was so consumed by the world he had built around himself that he had forgotten how to live authentically, how to find meaning in the little things. As the conversation came to an end and Adam and Sophie left, Tom sat back in his seat, a deep emptiness gnawing at him. His phone buzzed again, this time with an update about the production meeting. It was a reminder that the world was still waiting for him to play his part, to be the hero people needed. But as Tom glanced at the door where Adam and Sophie had exited, he realized something profound. They were living a life he had forgotten to live. But just as he was about to pull himself back together, he heard a familiar voice. "Hey Tom, mind if I join you?" It was Greg, his agent. Tom hadn't expected to see him here, of all places. But the man was always on the go. Greg slid into the chair across from Tom, looking as composed and polished as ever, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto Tom. "We've got a few things to discuss," Greg began, his tone professional but cold. "The studio's asking about your next steps. They're thinking about pushing forward with that action film we discussed last year. They want you to sign on for the lead role. Big paycheck, big project. You in?" Tom looked at him, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The familiar offer was there. Fame, wealth, another movie role that could solidify his place in Hollywood. But something inside Tom felt a resistance, something pushing him to reconsider. "I don't know, Greg," Tom muttered. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want out of this life. And I'm not sure if that's it anymore." Greg blinked, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean? This is what you've worked for your whole life. You can't just walk away from it." Tom's jaw tightened as he stood up, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not walking away from anything, Greg. I'm trying to figure out what comes next. And if that means turning down the next big project, then that's what it means." Greg's eyes darkened, but he didn't argue further. He simply stood up, giving Tom a curt nod. "You'll regret it, Tom. You always do." As Greg walked out, Tom's mind was racing. The pressure from all sides, his agent, the studio, the public, was mounting. The stakes were higher than ever. On one hand, he had the chance to continue living the life he had known for so long. On the other, there was something inside him, a small but growing seed of doubt, that was pushing him to break free, to find something more meaningful, something real. But the path wasn't clear. It never was. Tom was at a crossroads, torn between the man he had been and the man he could become. The challenges were growing, and the conflict within him was deeper than ever. The stakes weren't just about fame or money anymore. They were about his soul, about who he wanted to be when the cameras stopped rolling, and the spotlight faded away. Tom stood by the window, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The view from his hotel room in downtown Los Angeles was as spectacular as always. The sprawling city lights beneath him, flickering like a constellation of dreams. But tonight, the view felt cold and distant, just like the life he had been leading. His mind kept returning to the moments with Sophie and her father earlier in the day, their words repeating in his head like an echo that wouldn't fade. You don't have to be famous to be kind. The words were so simple, yet they shook him to his core. It was as if they were unlocking a door in his mind, one he hadn't dared to open in years. Was kindness really the answer? Was that the key to finding the fulfillment he so desperately sought? Or was he just running away from the life he had built for himself? Just then his phone buzzed. It was a text from Greg, his agent, with a subject line that read urgent, final decision needed. Tom glanced at the message. The studio is ready for you to sign the contract. They've cleared the schedule. They need an answer from you. Don't miss this opportunity. The weight of the decision hit him all over again. The same familiar crossroads. The path to the next blockbuster role. The fame, the wealth, the security that came with it. All of that was within his grasp. It was everything he had worked for. Everything the world expected from him. But then there was the other path. The one that terrified him. A life of authenticity. Where he could pursue something deeper than fame. Where he could be a force for change in ways that mattered. But how could he leave it all behind? Could he turn his back on everything he had worked for? The fear of being forgotten, of losing the status he had so carefully cultivated, gnawed at him. He wasn't sure who he would be without it, and the uncertainty left him paralyzed. The phone buzzed again, this time a call from Greg. Tom hesitated for a moment before answering. Hey Tom. Greg's voice was sharp and impatient. We need to talk. The studio is losing patience. They want to move forward with the movie, but we can't keep them waiting forever. It's time to make a decision. Tom took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. I know, Greg. I'm not sure anymore. I've been thinking a lot, and I'm starting to wonder if this is really the life I want. I don't want to keep chasing something that isn't making me happy anymore. There was a long pause on the other end, before Greg's voice came through, more frustrated now. This isn't about happiness, Tom. This is about your legacy. You have a chance to make even more money, to do something that's going to keep you on top for the next decade. Don't throw that away, because you're having a little existential crisis. You've been in the business long enough to know how this works. Tom's grip tightened on the phone. I'm not throwing anything away. I just don't want to be stuck in a cycle of doing things for the wrong reasons anymore. I want something real. Greg let out a short, dismissive laugh. Real? What, like a charity? Are you going to go off and live in some tiny apartment with no money, helping people? Is that what you think will make you happy? I don't know what will make me happy, Greg, Tom snapped, his voice rising. But I know I can't keep living for the applause. I can't keep living for everyone else's expectations. I need to figure out who I am without all of this. There was another pause, but this time, it was different. The silence felt heavier, almost like Greg was reconsidering his approach. Finally he spoke again, his tone quieter. Tom, I get it. I really do. But you have a responsibility. To your fans. To your career. To all the people who look up to you. You can't just walk away from that. Tom's chest tightened, and he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. But as he looked out the window once more, something inside him clicked. Sophie's innocent question came back to him. Why are you sad then? The truth was simple. He had everything the world said he needed to be happy, but he was still miserable. He was chasing shadows, and it had left him empty. No, Greg, Tom said finally, his voice steady but resolute. I can't do it. I'm not going to sign the contract. I'm done. Just remember, this could be the last chance you get to do something this big. Tom felt a pang in his chest, but the finality of his decision felt right. He hung up the phone and let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His heart was still pounding, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of peace settling in. The next morning, Tom woke up with a clear sense of direction. He was ready to step away from the world he had been living in. He was ready to find a new path, even if it scared him. As he walked through the hotel lobby, He passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of his reflection. There, standing before him, was not just the movie star, the famous actor, but a man who had finally chosen to take control of his life. But as he stepped out into the world, the universe wasn't done testing him. Just as Tom was about to head to his car, he spotted a familiar face. A reporter from the tabloid press, the same one who had hounded him for years, ready to pounce on the next scandal. The reporter recognized him immediately and rushed forward with the camera in hand. Tom sighed, already bracing himself for the onslaught of questions. But before the reporter could get a word out, Tom turned to face him, a quiet resolve in his eyes. No interviews today. No more headlines, no more drama. I'm done with all of it. The reporter's expression shifted from eager to confused, but Tom didn't care. He had made his choice, and now, the world would have to follow his lead. As Tom walked away, he realized something profound. This was his moment of transformation. The world would still be watching, waiting for the next big thing. But he wasn't going to be that thing anymore. He was going to be himself, no matter how hard it was, or how much the world tried to pull him back in. And in that moment, Tom understood. The only legacy that truly mattered was the one he created for himself, not the one that was dictated by fame, fortune, or the expectations of others. The real journey was just beginning. As Tom walked away from the reporter, a strange sense of liberation washed over him. But it was tempered by the heavy uncertainty that lingered in his chest. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but he knew he had already taken the hardest one. The decision to leave behind the identity that the world had carved for him. He wandered through the bustling streets of Los Angeles, the same city that had both shaped and confined him. The faces of the people he passed seemed familiar but distant. Some of them waved, others didn't even glance in his direction. He felt like a stranger in his own world. It was as though the veil had been lifted, and he could finally see beyond the glittering illusions of his fame. As he walked, his thoughts turned to Sophie and her father. The encounter with them earlier that day had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Sophie's innocence and the warmth in her eyes had made him realize something important. It wasn't just about finding the right path. It was about connecting with people, not as a celebrity or a figure to be admired, but as a human being, someone with flaws and dreams, someone who had the power to make a difference simply by being kind. But as the sun began to set, a familiar voice cut through his thoughts, and he froze. Tom. Wait. It was Sophie, running toward him with her father trailing behind. Tom turned, a small, surprised smile forming on his face. Sophie, what's going on? Her face was flushed, and there was an urgency in her step. I couldn't let you leave without telling you something, she said, breathless. You changed my life today. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any kind of thanks or recognition. He was still coming to terms with his own journey. I did. Tom stopped himself, unsure how to respond. Sophie's sincerity was overwhelming. Her words made him feel seen, for the first time in a long time. For who he truly was, not the persona the world had crafted for him. Sophie reached out and touched his arm gently. You gave me hope. When I heard you talking about choosing kindness, it made me realize something. It's easy to get caught up in the chase for fame and success, but it's the little things, the people we help, the moments we share, that really matter. Tom swallowed hard. He had wanted to make a change, but hearing Sophie's words, he realized that change wasn't just about him. It was about the ripple effect he could create. It was about the people he touched along the way. Her father stepped forward then, his expression softer than it had been earlier. I think you've made the right choice, Tom. You don't need to keep running after something that isn't fulfilling. You have a chance to really be something meaningful, and I can see that you're already on that path. The words hung in the air, heavy with their truth. Tom's eyes welled up, but he quickly blinked back the tears, unwilling to let his emotions take over. As Sophie and her father stood there, smiling at him, Tom felt the weight of his decision start to lift. The fame, the expectations, the contract, all of it felt less important now. What mattered were the real connections, the lives he could touch, the difference he could make. He realized that this was the turning point, not just for him, but for everyone around him. Sophie had reminded him of something simple. yet profound. The true power lay not in what he achieved, but in how he treated others along the way. As they stood there, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was his true calling, and it wasn't in the flashy lights or the golden awards. It was in being present, in embracing the simplicity of life, in choosing to be kind. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom knew that his journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. As the days passed, the weight that had once pressed heavily on Tom's chest began to lift, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of clarity. He had made his choice, and though it hadn't been easy, he knew it was the right one. The chaos of his life, the whirlwind of press conferences, red carpets, and flashing cameras, no longer consumed him. Instead, he had chosen to step away from the noise and focus on the quieter, more meaningful moments. His decision not to sign the contract was met with mixed reactions from those around him. Greg, his agent, tried to persuade him to reconsider, reminding him of the money, the fame, the prestige he'd be turning down. But Tom stood firm. He wasn't turning away from the dream he had worked so hard for. He was choosing to redefine it. For the first time in years, Tom found himself taking long walks in the city, without the constant buzz of work obligations. He spent time reflecting on what really mattered. His interactions with Sophie and her father had shifted something deep within him. They reminded him of the value of simple, unguarded connections, the ones that weren't motivated by power or fame, but by genuine care and kindness. Sophie, in particular, had become a symbol of hope for him. Her unassuming nature, her quiet strength, and the way she had never let her circumstances define her, had left an indelible mark on him. It was clear now that he had been missing out on something far more precious than the world of Hollywood: authenticity. One afternoon, Tom found himself sitting in a small park just outside of downtown Los Angeles. The air was warm, the sun low in the sky, casting a golden glow on everything it touched. It was here, in this quiet corner of the city, that he had come to truly reflect on his life, to look inward in a way he had never done before. He thought about the years he had spent chasing a version of success that had ultimately left him empty. There had been awards, red carpets, endless parties, and more attention than he could have ever dreamed of. But with all of it, there had been something missing: a sense of purpose, a deeper connection to something real. Tom had always known that there was more to life than the roles he played on screen. But it wasn't until he had stepped away from that world, until he had allowed himself the space to breathe, that he had truly understood what it meant to live a fulfilling life. He wasn't just Tom Cruise, the movie star. He was Tom, a man with imperfections, dreams, and a desire to make a difference. As he sat on the park bench, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sophie. "I'm so proud of you, Tom. I know you've made the right choice. Keep being you. You're changing the world one person at a time." The words brought a smile to his face. Sophie had no idea how much her kindness had impacted him. She was right. He was changing the world, but not in the way he had once imagined. It wasn't about the blockbuster hits or the fame. It was about the impact he could have on the people around him, the difference he could make by simply being himself. He glanced around at the people in the park, their lives unfolding in front of him. Families, friends, strangers, all moving through the world in their own quiet way. He saw the beauty in their simplicity, in the way they connected without needing an audience or validation. Tom's phone buzzed again, this time a call from Greg. Tom hesitated before answering, knowing that his agent would likely be less than thrilled with his recent decisions. "Tom," Greg said as soon as he picked up, his voice more serious than usual. "I need to talk to you." "Go ahead," Tom replied, his tone calm. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you, but you've got people worried. You're turning down huge opportunities, and you're starting to lose your place in the industry. You can't just walk away from everything you've built." Tom took a deep breath, the weight of the conversation pressing on him, but he didn't waver. "I haven't walked away from anything, Greg. I'm just choosing to live my life differently. I don't need to keep proving myself anymore. I'm done chasing fame and fortune. What I'm doing now is about something deeper. It's about real connections, about making a difference where it counts." Greg was silent for a moment, clearly processing Tom's words. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more understanding. "I get it, Tom. But just don't forget where you came from. You've got a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to everyone who's supported you. You can't just disappear, and you can't let everything go to waste." Tom smiled softly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I'm not disappearing. I'm still here. I'm just not who I used to be." As he ended the call, Tom realized something profound. The pressure to conform, to meet expectations, had always been an external force. It was never his own. The true responsibility he carried wasn't to the industry, or the people who expected him to keep playing a role. His real responsibility was to himself, to live a life that was true to his values, to pursue the things that gave him joy and purpose. And so Tom made a promise to himself that day. He would continue to make movies when they felt right, but he wouldn't sacrifice his soul for them. He would use his platform for good, for causes he believed in, and he would invest in relationships that mattered. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, Tom felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As he stood up from the bench, he looked at the world around him with new eyes. Eyes that saw the beauty in the ordinary, in the moments that often went unnoticed. And as he took his first steps forward, he knew the road ahead would be different, but it would be his own. The world would watch, of course, but this time, it wouldn't define him. Tom was finally free. As weeks turned into months, Tom's life began to take shape in ways he had never imagined. He still took on acting roles, but they were no longer about the fame or accolades. Each project he chose aligned with his values, his desire to tell meaningful stories, and his passion for creating change. He worked with charities, using his platform to shine a light on causes that mattered most to him: mental health, environmental conservation, and education for underprivileged children. He didn't seek recognition for it. Instead, he let his actions speak for themselves. One evening, while attending a charity gala, Tom was approached by a familiar face. Sophie. She looked even more grown-up now, her smile still as radiant as the first time he met her. Her father stood nearby, his quiet pride evident in his gaze. "Tom," Sophie greeted warmly. "I can't believe how much has changed in such a short time. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do." Tom smiled, grateful for the sincerity in her words. "Thank you, Sophie. You were the one who made me realize what really matters. If I hadn't met you, I might still be stuck in the same old cycle of chasing things that don't truly fulfill me." Sophie's eyes twinkled. It's funny how a single moment, a single conversation, can completely change someone's life, isn't it? Tom nodded, feeling the depth of that truth. Their conversation at the KFC had been a turning point for him, not just in his career, but in his life. He had always thought the big changes would come from the loud moments, the movies, the applause, the fame. But in reality, it was the quiet ones, the ones where people connected with each other on a deeper level, that truly shaped his path. As the night went on, Tom found himself in more meaningful conversations, not with the high-powered industry elites, but with regular people, volunteers, and even some young actors who had been inspired by his shift in focus. He felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in years. His life was no longer about living up to the expectations of others, or constantly seeking external validation. It was about being present, being authentic, and helping others along the way. Later that evening, as he stood outside on the balcony overlooking the city, Tom thought about the journey he had undertaken. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when the allure of his old life tried to pull him back. But each time, he returned to what mattered most: the small, quiet moments of connection. The ripple effects of kindness and authenticity had spread far beyond his own life, touching countless others. Looking out over the sparkling lights of Los Angeles, Tom finally understood something profound. The true measure of success wasn't in how many people knew his name, but in how many lives he touched. It was about the people he helped, the conversations that sparked change, and the way he chose to live each day with purpose and humility. In the end, Tom hadn't just found himself. He had found a way to help others find themselves too. And in that, he had discovered a joy far greater than anything he had ever experienced on a movie set or red carpet. As the night deepened, Tom turned away from the balcony, a content smile on his face. The story wasn't over, but it had taken a new direction. He had chosen a path that led to something real, something enduring. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. The end.